Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. If you're just joining us, what we do here is tuning and tips and tricks and hacks and myth busting and tone stuff, and it's a little bit of a tone game today. We're talking about terminology, how we're describing these sounds, all these words that mean different things to different people. There's a classic quote that goes something like, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. I like that one, and it kind of applies here, but we're talking about sound. And every drum, every drummer makes a sound, people talk about that sound, and they use a lot of words that are non-specific but mean a really specific thing to them. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. If you've been watching the show for a long time, we throw around a lot of these words, and it seemed like maybe we should have a little kind of go through and talk about exactly what these things mean to us. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario for being our presenting sponsor. I'm playing Rebound 5.5As today and enjoying them very much. And first off, these terms have been around for a long time, most of them. There are some that are newer, and some of them, the definitions have changed over time a little bit, but generally when people are telling me about a sound that they're after, like if I'm on a session or something like that, or if I'm describing a sound that I'm generating to someone, these are the sort of words that we use. Not just loud and soft or things like that, but fat, bright, articulate, things like that. So what we're going to do today is go through a bunch of drum sounds that to us exemplify these characteristics and talk a little bit about why they're doing that, what they're doing, and why we use that word. Now we got a lot of these here, so we're going to kind of shoot through them pretty quick. And the first one that we're going to use, which is one of the first ones that I heard, was lively, as in a lively snare sound. So briefly, lively to me means that overtones are present, that there's some sustain in the drum, that we can hear the wires are being activated, and that overall it doesn't sound like the drum is being squashed or muffled in any way, that there's a lot of life in it, hence lively. Number 2, buzz, as in snare buzz. Well, here we go. What I went after here was basically to get as much snare buzz happening in the sound, which is a way that we create sustain, and that also can be problematic, as you can hear this crosstalk from the bass drum. There's a little extra kind of behaviors going on in there that may not be necessarily desirable. Buzz can be good, it can also be bad. Number 3, pingy. Thinking about ska music, thinking about some punk music. Here we go. So pingy for me is very high-pitched and specifically coming off of the batter head, a literal kind of ping in the batter head. If you play dead center in the drum, there's less of it. I played a little off-center to help sort of boost that out. It's a super fun sound, it's brief, and there's a lot of music with that in it. It's worth noting that pinginess is an overtone thing. It's not a fundamental pitch thing. All right, next up, metallic. Metal drum, metallic sound. Here we go. So metallic basically has to do with the reflectivity of the inside of the shell and what that does to the sound. It's reflecting a lot of high end because it's hard, it's metal, it's smooth, and it's really going to boost the sizzle in the wires. It's going to boost the high end from the heads and overall give you a sound that to your ear sounds like metal. Janky. This is a little bit of a looser term, but it's one that seems to come up a lot with people that I know when they're talking about sort of like off-center, funky snare sounds. Here we go. Okay, so janky to me includes components of out of tune, maybe the wires are messed up. It's generally a drum that has some things that are broken or screwed up on purpose, or maybe not on purpose, to give a sound that is more about character than about accuracy or clarity or recreating kind of like a codified snare sound. Now, the all-important crack. What does that mean? Crack is probably the component of snare sound that gets talked about the most, at least in the circles that I run in. It tends to be specific to playing rim shots, though some people will talk about it in a fat back center of the drum kind of scenario as well. And this basically boils down to the pointedness of the sound, how much it's going to cut through the mix, how much impact there is in that very first instant kind of transient. Some drums will have a lot of crack and not much else to them and be kind of thin sounding, and other ones will have a lot more to them after that. But basically, it's how pronounced is the impact on the drum right at the moment that you strike it. Articulate or staccato. Staccato is a bit more specific to a kind of sound coming from a composer perspective. Articulate is more of just like a sound from the player's perspective, in my experience. But here, let's check it out. So whether you use the term articulate or staccato, which literally means separated, what we're talking about here is very short sounds where each little thing that you do on the drum is clear, articulate. You can hear the articulation on the head. There are low-pitched articulate sounds. There are bright articulate sounds. Generally on snare drums, they tend to be in the higher range. We think of them as, piccolo or classical, or just in general, anytime that you want to hear every single little thing you're doing from triple P to fortissimo. Okay, Boxy. This is a weird one. This is tricky to talk about, but let's listen to this. Boxy is a pretty difficult one for me to explain, and it's actually a little bit difficult to generate out of a drum on purpose. But the experience of playing a Boxy drum is basically that the heads aren't really resonating, the drum isn't really resonating, and hitting it harder doesn't really give you anything more. If anything, the harder you hit it, the less you're getting out of the drum. And this can result from a sort of phase cancellation issue between the heads, the wires being too tight, the heads being worn out, particularly if you have a drum where the batter head is very worn out and you tune it low, you'll hear a Boxy kind of experience. It has nothing to do with a box. I'm not sure why that's the word that people use, but we definitely run into it a lot. The issues in this sound tend to live in the low or low-mid frequency range, which is why pitching down is where boxiness tends to live. You can choke a drum out at a higher pitch, but boxiness is sort of more of a mid to low issue. Fat. Okay, now this is one that we hear all the time and we also use all the time. This is more of a directive of tuning than the crack kind of thing is. That can be specific to a drum that maybe always has crack in it, but fatness, that's more of a treatment and a tuning. So let's check it out. So that sounds pretty good to me. I like this sound a lot. I use this sound a lot. And fatness in the context that I think of it has to do with the width of the sound. Like how big of a sound is that strike making? It's not staccato. It might be articulate, but when you hit it, there's a big sort of bloom and length to the note that's taking up a lot of space. It's great for slow tempos or sparse playing. And it's very fun to affect because generally with a fat sound like that, we're doing some muffling, which means that compression and different things can come into play and make it particularly awesome. Choked. We have done videos about choked recently. If you've seen those, this may not be the newest of information, but let's choke it out and then we'll talk about it. Choking out a drum is basically exactly what it sounds like. We are using tension and squeezing the life out of it. And what that means is that it's a vibrating membrane, and if you tune it in a way where it's either so low it can't vibrate or so high it can't vibrate, it is choked. One of the heads being choked is enough to choke the whole drum, and both of them, which is more or less the case here, you can kind of hear that the drum is not happy that I'm hitting it at all. It feels really stiff. It hurts my ears to play it because there's kind of a snap in the wires because they're not able to get away from the bottom head and resonate. Generally, kind of a rough sound, but it's in a lot of older funk music, and it's in a lot of, jazz and things from back in the day where people were just using whatever drums were around. So it is an authentic sound for certain situations, and it's not necessarily a bad sound, but if you're struggling with it, that's why. All right, next up, woody. Kind of opposite of metallic. Let's check it out. Since we're talking about metal drums and wooden drums, we have a metallic sound earlier. This is more of a woody sound, and basically what that means to me, or what it's been told to me as meaning, is that the overall brightness of the drum is super diminished and the wire sound is present, but it's more about the sound of the heads. There's not a lot of overtones. Again, the brightness is suppressed as much as possible. This is a warm sound, which we're going to talk about in a second, and this is also a little bit of a short sound that is basically pleasant and blended. It's meant to not jump out too much and kind of sit in the mix in a comfy kind of way. How about dry? We talk about dry cymbals. What's a dry snare sound? Dry for drums is not dissimilar or not totally divested from articulate. Dry sounds tend to be articulate, but what we're more talking about is just a shorter sound. Whether it's a rim shot or playing in the center, we're dealing with a drum where once you strike it, not a whole lot happens afterward. There's not a lot of resonance, there's not a lot of sustain. I associate this sound with stave shell drums, which is why we're using this one. And not all stave drums are like this, but some metal drums are also very dry. This has to do basically with a drum that does not want to do a whole lot beyond the initial transient. And for some things, they're really the best, and other times you might want to pick something else. We've come around to warm. Warm is a sound that people use for lots of instruments, not just drums. Warmth is generally a positive thing. I haven't ever heard anybody complain about something being warm when the sound was warm, but let's check it out. Warm is on the same kind of spectrum as fat. It's in the same kind of spectrum as woody. It can be a little bit. Warm to me is pleasant, meaning it's not jumping out too hard. It's not cutting through the mix too much. Warmth in general is about a nice, complete kind of overtone, a nice fundamental, good small amount of overtones, and in general, just a sound that is pleasant to put into the mix. Again, not always what you want for certain things. You might need something more aggressive, but warmth even in your aggressive sounds in a bell brass or something like that, even if you're really smashing it, the reason why those drums are favored is because they will have a certain degree of warmth at a high tension when they're being hit extremely hard. So warmth in general, positive thing. Dead. There's a lot of dead drum sounds on records these days, and it's fun to think about where that came from. I'll talk about that in a minute, but first, here comes a dead drum. So for the dead one, I'm going to talk a little extra about this. We got the acrylite out. We used the drum head from a few weeks ago when we put tape underneath where the bearing edge touches on that head. And then I also put the widest E-ring that we had here on top of it. So basically, this is about as dead as it gets, apart from like putting a towel over the top of the drum. Dead drum sounds, we think of maybe the Eagles or the band, different things from kind of classic rock scenarios. Dead drum sounds, in my experience and based on what I've been told, are specific to minimal miking scenarios where you're trying to compress the sound of the kit and you can't have overtones flying off of everything because the compression on those microphones will blow those overtones out. So they would do whatever they had to the drums to make sure that each one was sitting in its own acoustic space and not interacting too much with anything else. So super dead drum is actually a really nice sound. It sounds like an Eagles record or something like that, and it's cool. And it's fun that it's coming back. It's a fun throwback. Now we've come around to punch or punchiness. There is a tuning component to this, there is a drum choice component to this, but there's also a big studio component to this. Microphone choice, compression, mixing, things like that. So we're actually going to add punchiness to the previous example and show kind of how to fold punchiness into a sound that you're already making that hasn't been affected. So as you can see, it's a little punchier. It's coming through a little stronger. The impact of the whole sound is a little bit more powerful. And yeah, overall, that's going to sit in the mix with a little more presence. Another one, wetness. To me, that's a snare wire thing. I think of wide wires with a lot of snare sound as being a wetter drum sound. I don't hear that term used that much anymore. I remember that a lot in the 90s and the early 2000s, people using that kind of terminology. Opposite, like the piccolo sound, like the thing you'd hear in like a lot of nu metal and things like that, there would be the wet sound. And this is another one where you can get a pretty wet sounding drum in front of you by having a lot of snare wires and not over tensioning them. But this is also a thing that is a studio issue. So reverb and certain kinds of compression will take a regular snare sound or a warm snare sound and wet it up. So we're going to do that here. So as you can see, that really changed the nature of the length of the sound of the drum and the way that the whole sound of it kind of interacts with itself to just make it a little washier. Wet, washy, yeah, those kind of go together. Now, if you've been keeping up with us, we did a video a few weeks back of 100 different snare sounds, which was a bananas rabbit hole to go down. And this sort of relates back to that because a lot of those sounds could be very correctly described with this terminology in one way or another. And it just goes to show you that there's a lot of different options out there. We used a lot of different drums today, but a lot of these sounds can be gotten out of a single drum. A Superphonic or an Acrolite will do most of these. The Craviotto alone will do most of these. And at the end of the day, it's also very important to understand what these words mean when you're talking to someone who's asking you to generate a sound. If they want a wetter snare drum sound, knowing what that means when they say that to you, or a more articulate sound, and then knowing what to do to get that. It's one of the things that made us start doing this channel in the first place, helping out with that kind of thing. And this has been super fun, just kind of going directly at these words, because a lot of people are wondering, what exactly we mean by them. There's going to be some more stuff from today over on the Patreon. Please go down below, click on the link, check it out over there. Please support us if you can. It really is facilitating our capacity to do more of these videos and start some new series for Season 3 that we are super excited about and desperate to announce. We've already planned out a lot of it, and we just have to figure out how to basically afford to make it happen. So please jump on that link below in the description. Go check it out, and if there's any help you can offer, we would really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification button below so that you find out about our new videos. We are still doing them every Tuesday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario for helping us out with sticks. Really enjoying the 55As today. Let us know if you have discrepancies with what you think these words mean, because the fun thing about words is they can actually mean different things to different people, and I have been very surprised, especially with singer-songwriters in the studio, with what they think these words mean, and then I would do what I thought it was, and it wasn't that. So yeah, let us know, and I'm looking forward to talking to you.